She was born into wealth, but fate sent her back to the house as a maid. A quiet fall from grace, without scandal, without noise, forced her to hide her name and enter through the servant's door of the same house where she once learned to walk. The walls that once echoed with her laughter now watched her in silence as she scrubbed their stairs. But what if the new master discovers who she truly is? What if the past isn't so willing to stay buried? Tell me, where in the world are you listening to this story from? And what would you do if you were forced to serve in the very house that once belonged to your family? Prepare yourself for a sweeping period romance filled with pride, redemption, and deeply stirring emotion. Virginia, 1867. In the misty valley of Ashbourne Hollow, where skeletal oaks leaned under the weight of early frost, and the wind whispered through the hills like an old hymn, stood the Hartwell estate. Built of pale stone with steep gables, narrow windows, and stairs that groaned with memory, it was a house born of another era, a house still standing, though its foundations had long been betrayed. There lived the Hartwell family, or rather, they endured. Lillian Hartwell, the eldest daughter, stood every morning at the same gallery window facing east. From there, she could see the silver ribbon of the river winding below, wrapped in fog. Her breath fogged the glass, but she never wiped it away. She remained motionless, as if her stillness could hold together what was quietly crumbling. The world as she knew it was shifting. No one spoke of it, yet everything screamed it. The letters that once arrived weekly had stopped. The accounts, once reviewed with discipline, were now locked away in a drawer whose key her mother kept beneath the cushion of her chair. Her father, Mr. Henry Hartwell, no longer came down to breakfast. He spent his days in the study, alone with papers that fed the fire each night. The smoke smelled of shame. Mary, her younger sister, still embroidered flowers on handkerchiefs, asking if there would be a New Year's ball that winter. Mrs. Margaret Hartwell, their mother, stitched as well, but without seeing. Her eyes followed the needle, but her thoughts had drifted far away with the last snowflake of dignity. Lillian alone watched the collapse without blinking. She did not cry, she did not ask questions, but she recorded every detail in the silence of her soul. On the morning of November 23rd, the front gates creaked open with a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the timid rustle of a servant, nor the measured pace of a neighbor. It was the stride of someone who did not ask permission. Lillian knew it before she saw him. A tall man with a sure step in a dark coat crossed the threshold. Snow clung to his boots, but not his bearing. Lillian descended the stairs just as Mrs. Constance Hartwell, her father's elderly aunt, emerged from her corner of shadows. With cane in hand and eyes sharp as ever, she examined the newcomer. He removed his hat with a subtle nod of courtesy, but offered no explanation for his presence. He carried a leather folio under his arm. It was in the drawing room before the faded portrait of Grandfather Hartwell that Mr. Andrew Montgomery spoke the words that shattered what little still stood. "I bring the transfer papers. As of today, this estate is the property of my family." The silence that followed was like that of a freshly opened grave. Margaret dropped her embroidery frame. Lillian did not move. Her father, called in haste, arrived late. He entered with his waistcoat unbuttoned, his face pale, and a smile that pretended not to have heard. "There must be some mistake, Mr. Montgomery. I haven't sold anything." The gentleman opened his folder and pulled out papers freshly signed in black ink. The initials of Henry Hartwell repeated across every page. Lillian saw it, saw her father lower his gaze, his lips tighten, his body shrink as if to disappear. The lie, which had hovered like warm mist for weeks, dissolved in an instant. Mary, too young to understand, reached for her mother's hand. Mrs. Constance sighed as one who had known it all along. She said nothing, only turned slowly toward the stairs. Mr. Hartwell stood frozen in the center of the room. There were no more words, only the sound of the folder being closed. Lillian stepped forward,
her gray eyes steady as ancient ice, fixed on Montgomery, not in pleading, not in outrage, but with the clarity of one who faces the abyss without retreat. "Then what must be done shall be done," she said plainly. And so, in a matter of minutes, Hartwell House ceased to be a home. It became a possession, a shell with tall windows. The departure was silent, no porters shouting, no neighbors offering help. Just a simple cart, a shawl over Margaret's shoulders, and a suitcase in Lillian's hands. Mary wept at leaving the lamp in her bedroom. Lillian covered her with her cape. The last to step through the door was Mr. Hartwell. He climbed into the carriage without lifting his eyes. From that day on, no one ever heard him speak again. Hartwell House closed its doors with a groan that only Lillian heard, and though there were no witnesses and no ceremony, everyone knew that day, in the hush of the valley and the early snow, an heiress had been buried beneath the name of a maid not yet born. The snow continued to fall stubbornly over the rooftops of Ashbourne Hollow. The streets, lined with dark wooden homes and fogged-up windows, wore the hush of winter. It wasn't the elegant silence of Hartwell House, but one more rugged, more modest, laden with furtive glances and whispers held behind cupped hands. There, in a low house with chipped walls and a coal stove that barely warmed the room, the Hartwell family now lived. Lillian left early each morning. Before the neighbors stirred, before the light reached the riverbanks, she stepped into the cold alone, her face hidden beneath a woolen hood knitted long ago by her mother, when there was still fine yarn and time for lovely things. The wind bit her cheeks, but she never flinched. Her steps were steady, her bearing still proud, even though her boots were worn, and the hem of her dress showed signs of having been trimmed more than once. At home, Mrs. Margaret Hartwell sat quietly by the window, stitching small pieces of fabric with trembling hands. She was no longer the woman who hosted formal dinners or served rosewater tea in the sunroom. Now she was only a still figure wrapped in a faded shawl, speaking little and breathing with effort. Her gaze wandered, as if searching for something already gone.
Lillian answered gently, disguising the truth with soft phrases. But at night, when the fire crackled low, Mary cried silently beneath her blanket, and Lillian lay awake, listening without a word. One morning, as the wind whipped heavy flakes across the village lanes, Lillian passed by the general store. In the frosted window, a small notice was pinned with a rusty tack. It fluttered faintly in the damp air. Her eyes stopped. She didn't need to read it twice. Help wanted. Domestic work. Hartwell House. Discretion required. The ground beneath her seemed to tilt. Hartwell House. Her home. Her history. Her ruin. She swallowed hard. For a moment she considered walking on, pretending she hadn't seen it. But something deeper than pride made her stay. The note bore no date, no contact name, only an instruction. Ask for Mrs. Whitaker. Lillian closed her eyes. She remembered Mrs. Whitaker. Tall, severe hair in a tight bun, voice like a whip. She had once worked at the estate when Lillian was a child, leaving after a quarrel with the butler. Apparently, she'd returned. Lillian didn't know if she'd be recognized. She didn't know if it mattered. That evening, she said nothing at home. She served the soup with grace, cleared the plates, and climbed the stairs as though nothing had changed. But she didn't sleep. She stared at the low, uneven ceiling for hours, thinking of the hallways in her former house, the scent of wood smoke, the creak of old doors. She wondered if the fountain in the garden still murmured beneath the ice. At dawn the next day, she combed her hair carefully, pinned it in a low bun, put on her best remaining coat, and set out. The service entrance to Hartwell House was just where she remembered it, a plain wooden door beside the north wing. She knocked twice, her heart beat against her ribs. When the door opened, the figure in the doorway was exactly as she'd pictured. Yes. Mrs. Whitaker's tone offered no space for pleasantries. "I'm here about the posting," Lillian said, lowering her gaze slightly. "For the position of maid." The woman studied her. Her eyes examined the pale face, gloved hands, and proud posture. She said nothing for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." "Name?" Lillian hesitated. Not for long, just enough for the air between them to tighten. "Lillian. Lillian North." The lie came softly, barely a shift from the truth. A common name, one no one would question. Mrs. Whitaker nodded. She led her through a narrow corridor, different from those Lillian had known. Everything felt colder, more distant, less familiar. The house had changed, and not just in appearance. The walls no longer spoke. The lamps no longer glowed with warmth. "There's no time for fussiness," said Mrs. Whitaker, without looking back. "The north wing rooms need daily cleaning, fires lit each morning, curtains aired, dust wiped down. If guests arrive, floors are scrubbed. No chatting with the family, no questions. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Lillian replied, her voice steady, though her insides trembled. "Good. 5 o'clock sharp." Lillian nodded. As she left the kitchen, she kept her gaze low. The stone floors beneath her feet were the same she had once danced upon in velvet shoes. Now she wore boots with thinning soles. That evening, back at the cottage, she said nothing. Her mother didn't ask where she'd gone. Mary chattered about dolls sewn from scrap fabric. Lillian poured the tea, lit the lamp, and when night fell, she sat before the fire. But the silence in her chest wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something new. Painful, yes, perhaps humiliating, but necessary. The next day, when she crossed the threshold of Hartwell House once more, no one knew that the maid walking the halls in silence had been born in that very house. And though the name she gave wasn't hers, every corner recognized her footsteps. Only pride held her upright. Only memory guided her. And deep in her heart, a voice whispered that not all was lost as long as something still stood to reclaim. Winter sunlight fell at a slant over the marble steps of the main hall, washing them in a pale, cold glow. Lillian on her knees scrubbed in slow, steady strokes, as if the cloth might wipe away more than just the dust of passing boots. It wasn't the labor that wearied her. It was the invisible weight of the place, the charged air of memory that refused to accept her new station. Her hem of brown dress grazed the floor, stained with dried mud brought in by other servants. Her hair, pinned beneath a crisp white cap, had come loose in a few golden strands that clung to the nape of her neck with the damp. She had learned to move like a shadow, silent, unnoticed. But that day, something shifted. The sound of boots echoed against the stone, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Not the scurry of kitchen help, nor the drag of Mrs. Whitaker's steps. These belonged to someone used to being heard.
Lillian did not look up, but her body tensed. She already knew. Mr. Andrew Montgomery walked along the gallery from the east wing, clad in a long wool coat, his boots dusted with frost. He had just returned from overseeing his land holdings. The breeze still tugged at the ends of his scarf. He stopped when he saw the figure bent over the steps. A maid, he thought at first, just another. But something made him pause. Lillian raised her head just enough to see him. Their eyes met briefly, her steel gray gaze unwavering, calm, neither submissive nor bold, just present. Something about it unnerved him. He'd seen countless maids in his life, but none had held his gaze that way. There was no fear, no deference, only a stillness that felt strangely defiant. "You're new," he said, more to himself than to her. "Yes, sir," she replied, already rising, spine straight, hands folded at her apron. Her voice was clear, unwavering. Your name? Lillian North. Montgomery nodded slightly, as though the answer sufficed. He looked away and continued down the hall. He said nothing more, but as he passed her, his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. There was something unsettling about the way she stood, too dignified for the floors she had just scrubbed. From that day on, he began seeing her more often, not by chance, but because he sought her out. He saw her in the kitchen, polishing preserves with an unusual care. He glimpsed her in the corridor carrying linens with calm precision. He heard her voice answering Mrs. Whitaker's orders with quiet poise. But that wasn't what disturbed him. It was how she moved, how she remained whole. Lillian wasn't submissive, nor was she proud. She was something else, a contradiction. Without understanding why, Montgomery began assigning her tasks that weren't hers. Small things, asking her to check if the dining curtains were aligned, to count the candles in the china cabinet. Excuses. She never complained. She merely nodded and complied. But he noticed the slight lift of her brow, the subtle tilt of her chin, as if to say she knew exactly what he was doing and would not be moved by it. Lillian, for her part, felt the pressure of his gaze more and more. She knew he watched her, knew something about her unsettled him. She sensed it in his silences, in the way he would sometimes stop mid-step, as if her presence had disrupted his thoughts. But she would not yield. From the moment she entered the back door of her former home, she had made a decision. She would seek no sympathy, no affection, no justice, only work, only silence. One afternoon, as she arranged the brass candelabers in the smaller parlor, she felt his presence behind her. She hadn't heard him enter. Lillian turned her head slightly. "Shouldn't you be in the kitchen?" he asked, not harshly, but not kindly either. "Mrs. Whitaker assigned me this room, sir," she replied calmly. Montgomery walked past her, stopping at a window. He rested a hand on the wooden frame and looked out at the frost-covered garden. "The wind's been cruel this winter," he murmured almost to himself. Lillian said nothing. She continued polishing, though her pace slowed. "Are you from around here?" he asked suddenly. She stiffened, kept her eyes on the brass. "Yes, sir. Born and raised in this town." He nodded, as though that answered something for him, but he said no more. He left her there with a silence that lingered long after his boots had vanished down the corridor. That very evening, Miss Isabel Crawford arrived with her mother. Isabel was tall, perfectly poised, with high cheekbones and flawless manners. She wore a deep burgundy velvet dress, lace gloves, and a feathered hat just so. Her smile was constant, but never touched her eyes. At dinner, Lillian served the table. She kept her head bowed, but caught every word. Isabel spoke of Parisian fashions, of recipes brought from Boston, of the quaint habits of rural households. Montgomery replied in monosyllables. His eyes drifted from the table settings to the silverware, but never to his bride-to-be. At one point, Isabel made a passing remark about the new maids. "One of them carries herself oddly well," she said, with a dry laugh. "Where on earth did you find her, Andrew?" He didn't answer. He simply took his wine and drank it in one long, slow gulp. From the dining room door, Lillian felt heat rise to her neck, not from shame, but from restrained fury. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, only gripped the tray tighter, her knuckles turning white. That night, alone in her narrow room, Lillian looked at her hands under the flickering light of a half-burned candle. They were rough now, red from cold water and wax. She remembered how they once were, soft, adorned with jade rings her mother gave her on her 15th birthday. But she did not cry. She knew pride doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands tall. And she was still standing, even as the weight of the world threatened to crush her from above.
Winter gave no mercy at Hartwell House. Frost crusted over the bare branches of the oaks, and the wind pushed through the stone walls like a living thing, thick and biting, settling deep into the bones. The corridors held a heavy stillness, as if the entire house were holding its breath. Nothing moved, nothing dared shift, except Lillian. That morning, Mrs. Whittaker appeared in the kitchen with a deeper frown than usual. In one hand she carried a porcelain tray of untouched cookies, in the other a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Miss Constance refused every maid who went to her yesterday," she announced without looking at anyone in particular. "Said she doesn't know why we pay them if they can't read without stammering like schoolgirls." The other maids pretended not to hear. One dropped a fork just to have a reason to crouch beneath the table. The old aunt of Mr. Montgomery, though confined to a wheelchair, still wielded the temper of a queen and the tongue of a magistrate. "You," said Mrs. Whittaker, pointing to Lillian, "you read well. Come with me." Lillian looked up. For a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something closer to a foreboding. Still, she nodded calmly, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed the housekeeper down the carpeted hallway. The room where Miss Constance Montgomery lived sat at the far end of the south wing, removed from the noise of the household and tucked behind thick curtains and aging furniture. The air smelled of camphor, old paper, and a floral scent, faint but stubborn like a memory. The elderly woman sat by the fireplace wrapped in a dark green shawl. Her cane rested across her lap, and her sharp, clear eyes fixed on Lillian with a look somewhere between weariness and expectation. "Another one?" she murmured without enthusiasm. "If she's useless too, don't bother sending another." Mrs. Whittaker placed the tray on a side table and left the room without reply. Lillian stepped forward in silence and sat on the stool by the hearth. On a low table rested a thick, dusty book with worn brown covers. She lifted it carefully and opened to the page marked with a velvet ribbon. It was a moral treatise, full of endless sentences and quotes from men who spoke more of duty than of soul. Lillian began to read with a steady tone, free of flourish, pacing her pauses just enough. The old woman did not interrupt, but after a few minutes, the tapping of her cane against the floor demanded a stop. "Dull," declared Miss Constance. "Don't you know how to read with life?" Lillian closed the book slowly. She didn't argue. She let the silence linger for a few moments. Then, instead of reopening the page, she began to speak. "Once there was a shepherd so clumsy he lost every sheep in a storm except the tiniest one, the only one too slow to run away." Miss Constance squinted. "Is that in the book?" "No, ma'am, but I thought a bit of true storytelling might liven the afternoon." The old woman didn't respond, but her cane stopped tapping. From that moment on, Lillian returned each afternoon. At first she held the book out of courtesy, but soon the words became her own. She transformed ponderous texts into vivid tales, turned sermons into frontier adventures, spun moral fables into stories where maids saved kings and farmers tamed dragons with kindness. Miss Constance began to laugh, a dry, rasping sound, but honest. Her face, once granite, softened with new lines, lines carved not by age, but by long-denied joy. She asked for fennel tea, adjusted her spectacles, and feigned boredom when Lillian arrived late. But if she was 5 minutes delayed, the cane struck the floor like a battle drum. One afternoon, as Lillian spun a tale of a young lady disguised as a farm girl escaping an enchanted estate, a shadow passed across the doorway. Mr. Montgomery, walking down the hall, had heard a voice not like the others, not the dull, timid tones of the staff, but a cadence warm and steady enough to make him pause. He stepped closer, silent, and opened the door just a crack. Lillian did not see him. She continued her tale with her gaze fixed on the old woman, who pretended disinterest, but toyed with the tassel of her shawl like a child. And so, with a basket of wild strawberries and a dagger tucked in her sleeve, the maid stood her ground before the forest bandits. Miss Constance let out a rough laugh that made the nearby lamp glass tremble. From the doorway, Montgomery didn't move. The fire's light lit half of Lillian's face, and for the first time he saw more than composure. He saw light. He saw life. He stayed for a few more moments unmoving, until the creak of a floorboard beneath his boot made him retreat. He left unnoticed, his brow drawn, and an unformed thought stirring in his mind. Inside, Lillian finished the tale with a closing line that came from no page. And when the king asked who had saved his kingdom, she answered, "I'm just a maid with a good memory." Miss Constance lifted her eyes, watching her in silence. Then, after a pause, she spoke more softly than usual. "There's something about you I find unsettlingly familiar." Lillian blinked. "Do you know me, ma'am?" The old woman didn't answer. She stared for a moment longer, as if trying to find some hidden truth in the lines of her face. Then she looked away and reached for her cane. "You may go. Tomorrow. Don't be late." Lillian gave a modest curtsy and turned to leave. But as the door closed behind her, she felt the weight of that gaze lingering on her back, a suspicion, perhaps a memory buried in time. And as she walked down the corridor, book in hand and heart unsteady, she knew she had crossed a threshold far more dangerous than servitude, the threshold of being seen, not as a maid, but as someone who didn't quite belong in that uniform, as someone hiding a past she had no right to remember, as someone who, without meaning to, was beginning to occupy space in a heart that was supposed to be made of stone. Snow kept falling over Hartwell House like a white curse that refused to lift. The sky hung low, the air was heavy, and the day stretched on slowly. The winter of 1867 offered no mercy to the hills of Virginia. And within the mansion, the cold crept deep, not just into the walls, but into the bones of those who lived there. Lillian arose before dawn, her feet numb, fingers stiff with the chill that slipped through the cracks of the attic where she slept. Still, she dressed in silence, gathered her apron, and carefully descended the long staircase that connected the servants' quarters to the main kitchen. But that morning her body betrayed her. As she placed her foot on the first marble step, a tremor ran through her leg. Her vision blurred for a moment.
Enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to drop a quick comment telling us where you're watching from. And rate this story from 0 to 10. Your feedback means a lot. And if you're liking it, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this.
She reached for the wall, closed her eyes, and waited for it to pass. It didn't. She descended 3 more steps, unsteady, until the world began to spin in a silent vortex. The sound of her bucket clattering against the stone was the last thing she heard before everything went white like the snow in the courtyard. They found her collapsed on the floor, face pale, lips cracked, a thin frost beginning to settle in her hair. A young stable boy was the one who ran to fetch Mrs. Whittaker, and when she saw Lillian unconscious, she did not hesitate to call out for help. What no one expected was that it would be Mr. Montgomery who responded. He came down the corridor with long strides, cutting through the group of frightened servants, and stopped at her side. His expression wasn't one of alarm, but of something deeper. He knelt, rushed the back of his hand against her forehead, and murmured something only Mrs. Whittaker heard. "She's burning up with fever." Without another word, he lifted her in his arms. Lillian's body was light as linen, yet somehow felt immeasurably heavy with what it symbolized. He carried her to a small room off the main wing, modest but with a fireplace. He ordered a fire lit, water boiled, broth prepared. No one dared question him. When Lillian awoke, the late afternoon light filtered through worn curtains. Her head ached, her throat tasted of iron. She tried to sit up, but a firm voice stopped her. "Don't move!" She opened her eyes fully. Mrs. Whittaker stood beside the bed, a porcelain cup in her hands. "You've been raving with fever all day. Here, drink. This is broth. No arguments." Lillian tried to speak, but a cough stole her breath. She accepted the cup with trembling hands. The steam rose in soft curls, warm and comforting. She took a sip. The flavor was plain but soothing. "You'll stay here tonight, by order of Mr. Montgomery," added the housekeeper, her tone quieter now. "He brought the broth himself." Lillian looked down, uncertain. The warmth she felt didn't come from the fire or the soup, but from the knowledge of that unexpected gesture. Hours later, as the fever began to ease, the door creaked open. Lillian pretended to be asleep. She heard soft steps over the rug, a faint creak from the nightstand, the quiet sound of something being set down, a clean handkerchief and a new bowl of broth, then silence and the door clicking shut. She didn't need to open her eyes to know who it had been. The next day was gray. Lillian insisted on returning to her duties, but Mrs. Whittaker, following the master's orders, denied her. Confined to rest, she spent the morning mending a hem in silence. That afternoon, she asked permission to walk briefly in the snowy garden. Upon her return, her body felt steadier, but her mind more unsettled. That's when she saw her. Isabel Crawford, flawless in a navy velvet coat trimmed with white fox fur, descended the front steps with slow, practiced grace. The snow crunched beneath her fur-lined boots. She walked as if each step were a demonstration. Her eyes, however, did not shine. When she saw Lillian standing by the frost-covered rosebush, she paused. "They say Mr. Montgomery has shown great generosity," she remarked, without greeting. "Such a shame when noble hearts are wasted on those who don't know their worth." Lillian didn't answer. She bowed her head slightly and lowered her gaze, as if the words hadn't touched her. But inside, something sharp pierced her chest. It wasn't rage, it was shame, not for herself, but for being seen as someone lesser, someone inconvenient, someone invisible. Isabel turned and walked away with a shallow sigh meant to seem elegant. But behind her composure there was a blade. She knew something in her world had begun to shift. That evening, Mr. Montgomery ate in silence. It took only a few bites. When Miss Constance asked if Lillian would come read to her as usual, he shook his head. "She's recovering. Let her rest." "It bothers you, doesn't it?" murmured the old woman with a faint smile. "I understand. I, too, was confused at first." He didn't reply. He stared out the window. The moon filtered through the bare trees, casting long shadows on the snow. His wine-glass sat untouched. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, you know exactly," Miss Constance said, setting her cane aside. "You look at that girl like it hurts you that she doesn't look back." Montgomery narrowed his eyes. He wasn't a man prone to visible emotion, but that night her words lingered like a melody he couldn't forget. And in the halls, when the wind whistled between the stones, he found himself looking often toward the places where she used to pass, and not seeing her had become a new form of loneliness, one more dangerous, one he no longer dared name. Spring had begun to timidly brush against the edges of the Virginia countryside, yet the wind still carried a biting chill that curled through the shutters of Hartwell House. The trees had yet to blossom, and the sky remained a heavy gray, as though it held back secrets that no one inside dared to speak out loud. Though the frost had begun to thaw, something in the air remained frozen, something that had nothing to do with weather. Lillian had returned to her duties. Her steps were steady, though more deliberate. Illness had left her bones fragile, but her will had not been touched. Her hands resumed their rhythm, but her eyes lingered longer at the windows, as if expecting something or someone to appear on the other side of the glass. That morning, as she gathered some books from the small library, Mrs. Whittaker approached with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Montgomery requests your presence in the study, the West Wing." Lillian lifted her eyes, surprised. It wasn't common for servants to be summoned there. That part of the house belonged to matters of men, papers, visitors, decisions far above a maid's station. She nodded without speaking, washed her hands carefully, smoothed her apron, and walked the long hallway lined with portraits of former owners, who seemed to watch her pass, as if they knew the woman in uniform had once borne their name. At the door to the study, she paused, took a breath, then another, as if convincing herself that nothing could wound her now more than being forgotten ever had. She knocked softly.
"Come in," came his voice, measured but different, as if something inside him had been disturbed. She entered. The study was wide, paneled in dark wood, lined with shelves full of leather-bound books. On the desk lay a stack of unsigned documents, a quill resting in its inkpot, and a half-full glass of brandy. Andrew Montgomery stood at the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the pale midday light. "You sent for me, sir?" Lillian asked, her voice composed, her hands folded over her apron. He didn't respond right away. He turned slowly to face her, and when he did, there was something in his eyes that was difficult to name, something clouded, human. "Yes," he said finally, "because I can't keep silent any longer." Lillian's brow tensed slightly, but she didn't move. "I don't understand, sir." He took a step toward her. His posture was controlled, but there was something raw behind it. "Since the first day I saw you in this house, bent over the marble steps, I haven't been able to forget you." Lillian said nothing. She blinked just once, as if his words had fallen like salt on an open wound. "I shouldn't say this," he continued. "I know it's improper, but I'm tired of pretending indifference when every quiet gesture of yours shakes me more than a thunderstorm. The way you walk, the way you hold yourself, refusing to bow to your misfortune, it unnerves me, it consumes me." Lillian drew a breath. Each word was a dagger wrapped in velvet. "Do you believe you can speak to me this way simply because I'm a maid?" she whispered, barely audible but firm. "I don't see you as a maid," he said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I know there's something about you that doesn't belong in this uniform, something that ties you to this house's past." "So what then?" she interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. "You're drawn to what you can't explain? Is it thrilling to desire a servant who feels like a character from some forgotten portrait?" He clenched his fists. "This isn't a game, Lillian." "Isn't it?" she shot back. "Is this some romantic confession, an emotional experiment behind the doors where you command and I obey?" Her cheeks flushed, not from modesty, but from restrained fury. "You don't know who I am or what I've lost. You don't know what it costs to rise every morning and disappear into the walls. And now you tell me I linger in your thoughts because I don't fit among the rest of your help?" Montgomery faltered. His face, always so carefully composed, cracked just slightly. "I didn't mean to offend you, but you did." Lillian took a step back. Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. It was the tremble of someone choosing not to fall. "You can't say these things and expect me to receive them with grace. I'm not some curiosity for your indulgence. And you, sir, are not a collector of delicate misfits." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something different in his expression, something between defeat and respect. "You're right." The words fell between them like a verdict. "You may go," he added, turning again to the window. Lillian nodded once, her curtsy slow, precise.
Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. The sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor. She didn't cry, she didn't clench her teeth, she didn't run. She walked. Each step an act of dignity, a refusal to shatter. That night, in the great room, Montgomery sat alone by the fire. The logs crackled, sending sparks into the dim light. His brandy glass remained untouched on the side table. The servants gave him wide berth. Miss Constance had retired early. No one disturbed him, and yet he could not escape the cold, for the first time since he'd purchased the estate and assumed his place among the valley's gentry, he felt no warmth, not from the hearth, not from the liquor, not from his rank. The warmth he had begun to crave had left with quiet steps and with a name he still didn't dare speak aloud. The sky over the valley had sunk into a deep gray, with low clouds pressing down on the rooftops like layers of damp wool. The rain had yet to fall, but the wind promised it would not be long. Inside Hartwell House, silence had grown thicker, like a held breath that stretched through each corridor, heavy and expectant. The halls felt longer. Every footstep echoed as if looking for someone who no longer walked there. Miss Constance, seated by her window, no longer asked for company. Mrs. Whittaker moved through her duties with mechanical order, and Andrew Montgomery from his study stared blankly through the same glass where Lillian once stood watching the frost-covered garden. Since the maid's departure, something had shifted in the air of the house. It wasn't just her absence, it was what she had taken with her. The balance, the composure, a kind of silent light. That morning, Montgomery tried to resume his routine. He shut himself in with ledgers, reviewed documents, pretended to read, but the hum of solitude seeped between every page. By mid-afternoon, he walked up to the main parlor. He found Isabel Crawford seated on the chaise, flipping absent-mindedly through an imported fashion journal. "Have you visited my aunt today?" he asked with quiet civility. Isabel didn't even look up. "Why should I?" "She needs someone to read to her." "You could." "Me?" she said with a mocking tone. "To an old woman who's deaf, half-blind, and prone to biting remarks? I don't entertain the elderly. That's what maids are for." Montgomery held back a reply that burned at the back of his throat. For a moment, a revulsion he had never allowed to surface stirred. Isabel's beauty, praised by many, suddenly seemed like a lacquer over something hollow. He left the room without a word. The silence he left behind was louder than any door slam. In the kitchen, he found a pot of fresh broth still steaming. He took a copper container, filled it carefully, wrapped it in a thick cloth. Then he headed to the stables, without being stopped, without offering explanation. He mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had traveled these roads often, though in truth this was the first time he rode toward that part of town with such an intention. The wind lashed at his face. As he descended the wooded paths that bordered the river, the scent of damp earth reached his nostrils. The first threads of rain began to fall when he reached the edge of town. He did not stop. In his mind, only one image guided him. Lillian's face, pale but defiant, carried by the kind of dignity that refused to kneel. The Hartwell family cottage stood humbly on a side street. No fence, no garden. The siding had lost its paint. A torn curtain hung from one window. The place had clearly been lent, offered out of pity or charity. Montgomery dismounted and knocked gently on the door. It was Margaret Hartwell, Lillian's mother, who opened it. Her face showed surprise, but no fear.
"Mr. Montgomery," he nodded, holding his hat in one hand, his face streaked with rain. "Forgive the intrusion. I heard Lillian hadn't fully recovered. I brought this." He lifted the bundle. "It may help." Margaret didn't answer right away. She studied him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to see beyond his soaked appearance. At last, she stepped aside and opened the door fully. "Thank you. You're welcome to come in. It's coming down hard now." He shook his head. "I don't wish to impose. Just let her know. I hope she recovers soon." Margaret nodded silently, her lips tight. From inside, behind a curtain, barely drawn back, Lillian had heard his voice. She rose slowly, weak but alert, and approached the window. There he was, standing in the rain, motionless, as if time had stopped with him. She couldn't hear what he said, but it didn't matter. His presence alone spoke more than words. It wasn't pity that had brought him. It was something else, something that hurt more deeply. The rain thickened. Montgomery replaced his hat and offered a final quiet nod before turning away. He mounted and disappeared into the mist that wrapped around the trees. Lillian let the curtain fall. In her chest, her heart pounded, not from fever, but from the dull ache left by his unexpected visit. She tried to believe it had been a gesture of courtesy, a way to mend the humiliation of before. But something in the way he had looked at her, in his silence beneath the rain, contradicted that notion. In the center of the room, Margaret placed the container on the table. When she lifted the lid, the aroma of hot broth filled the air. "It's still warm," she murmured, mostly to herself. "I don't want it," Lillian said softly from the doorway. "It'll do you good," her mother replied. "He hasn't brought this to anyone else. You know what that means." Lillian looked at her, torn between sorrow and pride. "I didn't ask for anything. I'm not his guilt. I'm not his regret." Margaret said nothing. She poured a serving into a cup and left it beside a piece of bread. Then she stepped away in silence. That night at Hartwell House, Mrs. Constance requested her tea earlier than usual. It was served without company. No one read to her. No one crossed the threshold beyond what duty demanded. But when one of the maids mentioned, without intending to, that the master had ridden into town during the rain with a delivery for the Hartwells, the old woman didn't ask questions. She requested no further details. She merely sipped her infusion, closed her eyes, and murmured, "Some men only learn to speak when there is no one left to listen." And in that whisper, there was more wisdom than in all the books Lillian had ever read to her, because there are silences that scream and gestures that strike deeper than any words spoken too late. The rumor spread through Ashburn Hollow as swiftly as a storm sweeping through the valley. The windows of Hartwell House were not thick enough to keep out the echo of what had happened. Andrew Montgomery had broken off his engagement with Isabel Crawford. The news struck like a stone dropped into the still waters of social expectation. The Crawford family, wealthy, influential, wasted no time accusing him of ingratitude. There were whispers of withdrawn investments, of broken alliances, of doors closing in circles where the Crawford name once opened every one of them. Some claimed Montgomery had gone mad. Others murmured about a woman, one without pearls around her neck or lineage behind her name. But he gave no explanation, wrote no letters, offered no apology. He simply signed a document, returned a ring, and fell silent. And it was this silence that wounded the Crawfords most. They were used to noisy scandals, not the quiet scorn of a man who no longer felt the need to justify himself. In the house, Mrs. Whittaker did not slow her pace, but her movements grew sharper. The servants whispered in corners. No one said Lillian's name, but her presence was felt like a ghost in every room. She had returned to work, yes, but kept a precise distance. She timed her steps to avoid Montgomery's. She no longer crossed through the West Wing, and when duty forced their paths to meet, she bowed her head with perfect courtesy, a formality more painful than any rebuke. Montgomery felt it. Every place she used to pass now felt colder. Though the house was just as grand, it had shrunk, not in size but in soul, as if some quiet light had refused to return with her. One afternoon, as the clock struck 5 and rain drummed on the glass panes of the conservatory, Mrs. Whittaker entered the linen room where Lillian was folding sheets with obsessive precision. "The master requests your presence," she announced plainly. "West Wing at once." Lillian didn't respond immediately. She finished folding the hedge of the sheet, then raised her eyes. "Did he say why?" "He seldom explains his orders," Mrs. Whittaker replied, arms crossed, "and you know that." Lillian gave a small nod. She removed her apron, hung it carefully, and left without a word. The hallway to the west wing felt longer than ever. The walls lined with ancestral portraits seemed to lean in, watching her pass, as if recognizing her face, though not her station. At the study door, she paused, knocked with steady fingers. "Come in," came the voice from within. She opened the door. Montgomery stood by the window, his sleeves rolled, his shirt slightly undone, his hair disheveled as though he'd run his hands through it too many times. He did not move when he saw her. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice deep. She remained near the door, upright. "I was told to report here." Montgomery lowered his gaze. Her courtesy cut deeper than anger. "You hate me," he murmured, taking a step forward. "And you have every reason. I acted like a fool." She said nothing. "I ended my engagement with Isabel." "That does not concern me," she replied softly, but firmly. "It does," he said, "because I did it for you." The room seemed to contract in that instant. Lillian's breath caught, but she held her posture. She could not afford to falter. "For me," she repeated, with no trace of irony or softness. "For a maid. For someone you barely acknowledged when she was lying with fever in the servants' hall." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" she interrupted. "A whim. A mistake you now hope to correct with tokens and speeches." Montgomery took another step, and this time his voice trembled. "It was fear. Fear of feeling what I shouldn't. Fear of facing my world. Fear of seeing you as something more, and not being able to turn back. And now what do you expect of me?" The question wasn't bitter, nor hopeful. It was direct, clear, as cold and honest as a winter gust. "That you tell me the truth," he said. "Did you ever feel the same?" Lillian finally looked at him, really looked. Her eyes were not wet, but they glistened with something deeper than tears. Truth held back for too long. "I felt it. I felt it even when I shouldn't have. I felt it even when you made me feel like I was worth less than the rug beneath your boots. But I also felt the weight of my name erased."
My pride swallowed. My nights of fever passed without a single knock on my door. He stepped closer, but she moved back just enough to draw a line between them. "I'm not a consolation prize," she said. "I won't be the aftermath of a broken engagement or the refuge of a man who doesn't know his heart." "Then what should I do?" he asked, the desperation now barely veiled. "Nothing," she whispered, "because what needed to be done, you did far too late." She turned, opened the door with calm, and without looking back, left. Montgomery didn't move. He remained where she'd left him, with the murmur of the wind slipping in through the stonework and the certainty that some decisions, however, just come too late, like a word of love whispered when the train has already left the station. The sun barely dared to pierce the clouds that morning, as if the sky itself feared, illuminating a day laden with unspoken meanings. Hartwell House, which for weeks had lived between rumors and silence, awoke cloaked in a thick mist that pressed its chilled fingers against the window panes. Inside, Lillian's footsteps echoed with the quiet strength of someone who no longer feared consequences, but still bore the weight of what could never be undone. Mrs. Whitaker had delivered the message bluntly. Mr. Montgomery wished to see her again in the study, the same study where days earlier he had dismissed her with wounded pride and confusion masked as control. The very room from which she had walked away, dry-eyed but torn apart. Now without apron or bonnet, her hair gathered in a low, simple bun, and dressed in the plainest gown of her modest wardrobe, she walked the wooden halls with the dignity of someone who did not regret her silence. Every step was deliberate, a choice. She did not expect apologies nor explanations, much less redemption. And yet her hands trembled. At the door to the study, she paused. Her hand hovered in the air. She inhaled deeply, once, twice, as if steadying her soul. Then she knocked. "Come in," his voice said, low and measured. She opened the door. The room was just as she'd remembered it. Fire burning in the hearth, the scent of wood, ink, and leather hanging in the air. Montgomery stood by the window, his coat unbuttoned,
shirt collar loosened as if haste had outrun decorum. When he turned, their eyes met. No words passed in the first few seconds, only silence, a tension so thick it seemed the walls, too, were listening. Lillian remained near the door, her posture straight, her hands gently folded. Her face was calm, but in her eyes lived a quiet storm. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quieter now. She didn't respond. "I know I don't deserve it," he added, "but I needed you to hear me." "I'm here," Lillian said, neither harsh nor gentle, simply a fact. Montgomery stepped forward, as though each stride were a confession in itself. "Since you came into this house, something changed. I didn't see it at first. At first it was only discomfort, irritation. I didn't understand why it unsettled me to see you pass by, why your silence weighed more than anyone's words." He stopped just a few feet from her. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from truth fighting its way through. "I felt trapped between what was expected of me and what I began to feel without wanting to." Lillian's gaze didn't waver. "You told me it was fear," she reminded him, "that you were a man too afraid. I believed you, and I acted accordingly." "I'm still afraid," he admitted, "but not of scandal, not of the Crawfords, not of what others might think. I'm afraid of losing you without having truly tried." She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When they opened, a shimmer remained, but no tear fell. "I am a maid," she whispered. "I have no name to open doors, no inheritance. I live in the house where I once was a daughter, and now serve as a stranger. I am broken. And you? You are the only real thing I've ever had," he said, cutting her off gently. "No amount of words can erase what you've endured. I won't pretend to fix what I ignored. But if just once you could believe that someone sees you, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the woman you are, then stay." He extended his hand to her. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't rehearsed or poetic. It was trembling, unsure, a hand that asked without demanding, that offered without condition, a hand that did not promise perfection, but simply a beginning. Lillian looked at it, then at him. For a long moment she seemed about to turn away, to leave him standing among words too late and courage come too slowly. But instead she raised her own hand slowly, hesitantly, and placed it in his. Their palms met gently, like a flame being passed between two souls. There were no kisses, no declarations, just the touch, just the offering. And in that touch, everything. The silence that surrounded them spoke louder than any vow. It was the language of two hearts that had been bruised, silenced, misunderstood, and yet chose to remain. Montgomery didn't smile, but his gaze softened. "Thank you," he whispered. Lillian met his eyes full, but dry. Her chest lifted, her feet remained planted. "Don't make promises you can't keep, because if I fall again, I won't rise a second time." He nodded, and he didn't let go. There, in that room where decisions had always held more weight than the portraits on the wall, where the past hovered like a persistent shadow, Lillian and Montgomery stood hand in hand. They didn't know what came next, whether society would forgive, whether scandal would rise, whether buried truths would return. But in that moment, none of it mattered, because after so much silence, so much pride, so much aching restraint, someone had reached out and the other had taken hold. The snow had begun to melt, but in the hearts of those within Hartwell House, a colder winter still lingered. It wasn't the weather that chilled the glances or hardened the words. It was the rumors, those that moved faster than the wind and cut deeper than frost-bitten ground. In the corridors of the house, there were no light conversations or relaxed footsteps. Every inch of the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict. The news had spread like wildfire. Mr. Montgomery had ended his engagement to Isabel Crawford and had taken the hand of a maid. A Hartwell, yes, but to most, that name no longer carried the weight it once had. To them, it was too late for bloodlines to cleanse away the stain of servitude. The cooks whispered with the laundresses. The footmen averted their gaze as Lillian walked past. One of the younger maids crossed herself at the sight of her. Another resigned that very afternoon. It was as if her mere presence disrupted the natural order of the house, as if she dared to occupy a space that in their minds would never belong to someone like her. Montgomery said nothing. He didn't deny the gossip. He didn't explain himself.
He moved through the halls with his head held high, his face unreadable, but those who knew him could see the tension behind the silence. It wasn't indifference. It was the instinct to protect what hadn't yet found a name. A week after the moment in the study, a letter arrived. It was delivered by a courier from the local council, a man with a rigid expression who declined tea and refused to sit. He handed over the sealed envelope with hands that trembled more from propriety than cold, and left without saying a word. Montgomery opened it immediately in front of Mrs. Whittaker, who had lingered near the door. The message inside offered no ambiguity. It has come to our attention with deep regret that your engagement to Miss Isabel Crawford has been dissolved, and that you are rumored to be entangled with a domestic in your employee. While your personal affairs are your own, those who carry respectable names must remember that private conduct becomes public example. We respectfully but firmly remind you that such behavior tarnishes the memory of your family and undermines the trust this community has long placed in you. The Civic and Ecclesiastical Council of Ashbourne. Mrs. Whittaker lowered her eyes. Montgomery carefully folded the letter and laid it on the desk. Then he rose, walked to the window, and clasped his hands behind his back. "Will you reply?" the housekeeper asked, her voice low. "Yes," he answered, "but not with apologies." That same night he wrote a brief response by hand. "Honor is not inherited, it is built, and I have chosen to build mine on truth. Andrew Montgomery." Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Lillian lived in quiet exile. She carried out her duties as always, but never crossed into the West Wing. She no longer read aloud to Miss Constance. She didn't exchange a single word with Montgomery. She buried herself in routine as the only way to keep breathing. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes told of sleepless nights and invisible battles. One afternoon, Mrs. Whittaker entered the linen room where Lillian was folding blankets with the same meticulous care as always. "Miss Constance has asked to see you," she said. Lillian placed the blanket down mid-fold. She straightened her dress, smoothed her sleeves, and climbed the staircase without a word. She knocked softly at the door she had avoided for weeks. The old woman waited in her armchair, wrapped in a pale gray shawl. Her white hair was pinned high, and her sharp eyes pierced Lillian's as she entered. "Close the door," she said, without raising her voice. Lillian obeyed. "Sit." She hesitated. "I said sit." She took the seat beside the bed, just as she had done so many times before, back when she used to transform sermons into stories and fables into adventures. Miss Constance didn't speak right away. She looked at her closely, then finally murmured, "I knew who you were the first day, not from your face, but from your dignity." Lillian blinked, startled. "You knew me, ma'am." The old woman nodded slowly. "Your mother and I were girls together. We shared the same sewing room. She was a Hartwell in every way that mattered, not by title, but by strength. Life cast her out of this house, but she never once lowered her head." Lillian lowered her gaze. A tremor passed through her shoulders. The Hartwells always knew how to fall without breaking, Miss Constance continued. But you've done something harder. You've remained standing through the humiliation of being looked at and not truly seen. Lillian pressed her lips together. I don't want to dishonor anyone, ma'am. I only want to live in peace. There is no peace for those who break the mold, child. But there is something better, the certainty of having chosen with your soul. She leaned in, her eyes glistening with something almost too tender for her stern face. Don't let go of that man's hand, Lillian, not even if it shakes, not even if it bleeds. Lillian didn't know what to say. She sat quietly, her eyes locked on the old woman's, while something warm and painful unraveled in her chest. That evening, while maids whispered in the kitchen and candles flickered across the dining room, Montgomery walked down the hall toward the back stairwell. He wasn't looking for answers or comfort. He only wanted to see her, to know she was still there, to know that despite the judgment of the world, there was still a place where a glance meant more than a name. And from the kitchen doorway, Lillian saw him pass. They exchanged no words, but both knew the harshest judgment to come wasn't from society. It would be the one they still had to face in their own hearts. Spring was barely beginning to show itself along the edges of the paths that wound through Hartwell House. The branches still stood bare, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet earth. A light drizzle fell, not heavy or bitter, but soft like the breath of the sky. It was the kind of rain that didn't inconvenience, but seemed to cleanse something deeper than dust. Andrew Montgomery walked the central corridor of the house with steady steps and a heart that could no longer contain itself. He wore a dark gray overcoat, and under his arm he held a folded dry handkerchief that he had taken from a drawer without thinking. The day before, Mrs. Whittaker had mentioned that Lillian had resumed her duties, though in silence, a silence that no longer spoke of resignation, but of distance. That morning, Montgomery did not come down for breakfast, nor did he go to the library or the office. He waited until she left the service wing, then sent a note through Mrs. Whittaker, folded carefully and placed atop a tray. The message was brief, 3 lines. The garden by the north veranda, if the rain does not trouble you. And she came. When Lillian stepped through the back door, she wore no bonnet, no cloak. The rain touched her hair like the fingers of an old memory. She walked slowly, as if reluctant to arrive, but unwilling to flee. Her boots sunk slightly into the soft earth, and the hem of her navy skirt brushed against budding plants that barely broke through the gravel. Montgomery waited at the end of the stone path beside a thicket of wild currants that in past years had borne fruit.
Behind him rose the north veranda, and beyond that the solemn profile of the house that had once been hers. Neither of them spoke at first. Lillian stopped 2 steps away from him. She lowered her eyes, then lifted them with quiet effort, as if her words would cost more than her breath. "I thought this wasn't necessary," she said softly. "After everything that's been said, after everything that's happened." Montgomery looked at her in silence. His eyes weren't pleading, they were steady, searching. "It is necessary to me," he answered, "because I haven't yet told you what truly matters." Lillian drew a long breath. The rain slid down her cheeks, not tears, but a reflection of them. Still, she didn't step back. "What is it you want to say, Mr. Montgomery?" He took a single step closer. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. "Since you entered this house, everything changed. These walls, these halls, even the quiet itself took on a different shape when your footsteps returned." She looked away, but only for a moment. "I'm a maid," she murmured. "I have no name to display, no dowry to offer. I have no position. I work in the house where I was once a daughter. I'm a woman who fell." "And you?" He removed his hat and let it fall beside him into the grass, as though it no longer belonged. "I don't want your name," he said with calm intensity. "But if you won't take mine, then take my life, because it no longer makes sense to me without you in it." His words floated between them like petals caught in the wind. Lillian felt herself tremble, but not with fear or doubt, with the weight of what he was offering, unasked. The rain seemed to pause, or perhaps they had stopped noticing it. "I'm not easy to hold onto," she whispered. "I'm not asking for ease," he replied without hesitation. She raised her eyes, and in that moment the world disappeared. There was no music, no sweeping declarations, no dramatic gesture, only a step, a gaze, and a kiss, the first. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It wasn't hungry or desperate. It was quiet, deliberate, a seal between two hearts that had known shame, duty, grief, and pride, and that now, in one suspended instant, recognized one another as equals. His hands did not grasp her. They rested gently at her face, trembling. And Lillian, overwhelmed and open, returned his touch with a tenderness she had not given since the day the world stole her name. The garden mist curled around them like the breath of trees long forgotten, and for that eternal second, even the bare branches seemed to bow in reverence. When they parted, Lillian didn't speak, but her eyes, clear, solemn, unflinching, held a quiet yes, not a surrender, but a choice born not from weakness, but from truth. Montgomery brought her hand to his chest. "You don't have to answer now," he said softly. "I only needed you to know. My life no longer has meaning without yours beside it." She nodded, just barely, then looked down, not out of shame, but reverence. And when she lifted her gaze again, she was no longer a servant walking through rain. She was a woman who had reclaimed her place, not through inheritance, but through merit. Lillian Hartwell had come home, and this time she would not enter through the servant's door. It was a clear morning, the first in weeks. The late flakes of winter had melted away completely, and the windows of Hartwell House shimmered in the soft light of a sun that felt almost indulgent. The estate, quiet and burnished with wood and care, seemed to hold its breath as new footsteps echoed through its corridors. Lillian Hartwell walked with her head held high. Her hair, loose for the first time in a long while, cascaded softly over her shoulders. She wore a deep blue wool dress, simple and refined, with long sleeves and a high neckline, modest and fitting for the season, but undistinctably dignified. In her hands she carried nothing, no books, no trays, no pails, only the certainty that she belonged. At her side walked Miss Constance Montgomery, cane in hand, stride measured but sure. She held Lillian's arm not as one who needed support, but as one bestowing her blessing. Her dark velvet coat still carried the scent of lavender and thyme. She said little, but her eyes missed nothing, alert, deliberate, alive again in a house that once felt colder than stone. The north gallery windows stood open. Pale curtains danced in the breeze. From there the blooming trees of the garden could be seen. The wicker chairs had been brushed clean, and an iron chandelier once again hung above the round dining table. There were no luxury flowers, no new tapestries, but everything was cared for, warm, alive. From the library, Montgomery watched them pass. Leaning in the doorway, he held a closed book in one hand and a wildflower in the other. His light gray morning coat hung open, as though fresh air had interrupted his reading. He didn't speak, he only watched, and when Lillian glanced over her shoulder, her brief smile was all that was needed. On the library table were fresh-cut flowers in a plain ceramic vase. There were open books, a quill, a half-written letter. Everything spoke not of grandeur, but of a life in motion, of a house no longer ruled by formality, but by shared purpose. Lillian Hartwell entered the main parlor just as the front door opened. "Mama, Mama, look how big everything is!" It was Mary, with new braids and a dress of soft flannel, skipping across the central rug without asking permission. Behind her came Margaret, slightly more stooped but serene. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, which she removed the moment she stepped inside. Lillian ran to meet them. There were no dramatic embraces. They took one another's hands, exchanged long glances, and walked the hallway together. The same hallway Lillian had once crossed in silence, eyes lowered. This time, their footsteps sounded different. The house, once filled with echo, now resonated with voices, soft laughter, footsteps that weren't servants, movements that weren't guests, movements that belonged. Miss Constance sat in her favorite chair in the eastern salon, the same chair from which she had once ruled with icy authority. Now she simply observed, wrapped in a blanket Lillian had placed across her knees. The house needed fire, and you lit it without striking a single match. In the dining room, a new maid poured tea. She did so with calm hands, no rush. No one pressured her. Montgomery entered a moment later and laid the wildflower gently on the table. Lillian saw the gesture, but did not speak. There was no need. It had become their daily language. Later, while Mary ran through the gallery counting windows, Lillian paused at the threshold of the study. The door was ajar, the same door that months before had seen her enter in fear and leave with her pride intact. Now she crossed that threshold with ease. On the far wall, above a polished wood panel, hung an old portrait, the Hartwell family. It had been cleaned, the frame restored with care. The painting, though humble, showed a man with strong features, a serene woman, and two young girls with the same gaze Lillian still carried. No one had dared hang it for years, as though the shame attached to the name was too heavy to bear. And yet there again it was, not as a relic of disgrace, but as a witness of origin. Montgomery approached from behind. He didn't touch her. He simply spoke. "I didn't want it hidden away. I thought it should be where it belongs." Lillian turned slightly toward him. "Thank you. Not for hanging it, but for bringing me back to where I belong." Montgomery said nothing. He offered his arm like one would at a formal ball. Lillian accepted it without hesitation. And so they walked through the house, among soft curtains, ticking clocks, and portraits that no longer felt heavy. They walked as two who had known winter, and at last felt the warmth of a home with fire. Snow once again blanketed the rooftops of Hartwell House. It fell gently and quietly now, as if time itself had learned to descend with reverence. From the hillside, the landscape appeared still, but inside the house, life pulsed.
Enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to drop a quick comment telling us where you're watching from. And rate this story from 0 to 10. Your feedback means a lot. And if you're liking it, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this.
Life pulsed with a warmth no winter could touch. Lillian stood in the north gallery, wrapped in a soft, pale gray wool shawl, her hair pulled into a loose bun. In her arms, a baby slept, no more than a few months old, fists curled, breath even. At her side, a girl of about 7 read aloud in a soft voice, sounding out each word with careful attention. She had her mother's quiet gaze and her father's steady resolve. Andrew Montgomery crossed the gallery with unhurried steps. His stride was slower than it had once been, his temples now silvered with time, though his bearing remained strong. When he saw their daughter reading, his smile appeared without effort. He stopped beside Lillian and pressed a kiss to her forehead, careful not to wake the child in her arms. "Have you been watching the snow long?" he asked quietly. "Since it began," she replied. "I was wondering if it still felt the same as that time." Andrew asked no more. He knew the she meant the Fate family name. "No," she said. "Everything's different now, but it's still beautiful." The house had changed, not in its architecture or furnishings, those still bore the soul of old days, but in its atmosphere. There were children's voices now, laughter that rang freely, lullabies at night, and sometimes the sound of the piano being played by Montgomery, with no audience but the past. Miss Constance had passed away 2 winters before, in the very room where she once demanded scripture and tea. She went peacefully, her hand in Lillian's, whispering with her final breath, "How beautiful to die in a place where one finally lives." Her portrait now hung in the parlor beside that of Margaret Hartwell, Lillian's mother. Margaret and Mary visited often. Mary, now of an age to sow her own dreams, arrived with sketchbooks full of wild ideas and questions about everything. Margaret had settled in a cottage nearby, knitted scarves by request, and tended an herb garden that now supplied the kitchen of the estate. No one ever again spoke of the absent father. It was as if time had dissolved the shame into silence. The town, however, had not forgotten so easily. The Crawfords lost much of their influence after the broken engagement. Gossip and speculation followed them like smoke. Some merchants distanced themselves from Montgomery, waiting for his downfall, but it never came. The times were changing. Younger generations in the valley saw his choices as a sign that honor no longer belonged only to those with names carved into stone, that perhaps something new was being written. Isabel eventually married a diplomat, many years her senior, and moved far away. She never returned. Montgomery, for his part, stepped back from most of his businesses. He kept only those that served the people directly. He built a public library in town, a reading room for women, and a school for girls. When asked why, he always answered the same: because one book can change the course of a family. Lillian, without titles or pedigree, became a beloved and respected figure, not because of charity or position, but because she had lived with her head held high, never returning contempt with contempt. She welcomed all with the same warmth, the heiress and the town doctor alike. She was the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. One autumn afternoon, their daughter, now 8, found a dusty portrait in the attic. It was the original painting of the Hartwell family. She ran down the stairs with it wide-eyed. "Are these my grandparents?" she asked eagerly. Lillian studied the portrait in silence. She brushed her fingers over the canvas and nodded slowly. "Yes, darling." They thought they had lost everything, but the future was still waiting for them. That evening they hung the portrait in the dining room, and for the first time Lillian no longer saw it as a relic of pain, but as the beginning of something far greater. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, snow covered the land with its quiet grace, but inside, within the heart of a house once stripped of its name, there burned a quiet certainty. True love does not fade with time. It transforms into home. Sometimes life takes from us all we thought we were, our name, our standing, our security. But no one can take away the dignity with which we face the fall.
This story was never only about a lost house or an improbable love. It was about the quiet strength of one who refuses to surrender, who rebuilds herself not with pride or vengeance, but through work, silence, and kindness. Lillian and Montgomery taught us that real love does not come from status or legacy, but from the deep recognition between two souls who see, choose, and honor one another. Names may be inherited, but greatness of heart is forged.